I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
Oxford wears October like a borrowed cloak, the mist reluctant to leave the shoulders of all souls, lamps turning every droplet to discreet confession. I walked without destination, as I often do when thinking proves impossible to avoid. Shop windows along the High offered pumpkins with enameled grins, cobwebs from factory spools, tins of toffee arranged like votive offerings to an imported ritual. How thoroughly commerce had colonized even death's mysteries, reducing the ancient dialogue between life and its absence to orange bunting and synthetic phantoms. I took my detour past Radcliffe Square, letting the stones remind me that ambition and weather are equally patient. The bells were between duties. Somewhere a bicycle rattled like dice in a leather cup. By Jericho the air carried a river's damp breath and the smell of yesterday's fires. Alone seemed an honest word for the evening ahead. The package waited on my mat, a jiffy bag damp at the edges, unfranked, unassuming. Someone had walked it here through the mist. The address bore my name and street as if Oxford contained only one, written in a librarian's careful hand. Round, precise, ashamed of flourish. Inside, a cassette in a brittle case with a label that seemed to tremble slightly. Street Simeon's College Chapel. Halloween choir performance. The pen had been stopped and restarted between words. Hesitant ink suggests interruption or cold fingers. The cassette itself was a cheap brand, the sort sold where quality becomes a shelf afterthought. Budget choices rarely accompany great secrets, unless the owner wishes to remain overlooked. I let Parsifal wander from the speakers, poured whiskey with the strict attention I reserve for unhelpful pleasures, and set the tape running. Choral sound rose as if the chapel had emptied itself of air and filled again with something purer. Latin rode the stone in long vowels, consonants polished to a scholar's discretion. I heard a conductor who believed restraint was its own music. Men, women, boys, a weave of devotion rich enough to make doubt seem an affectation. Duruflé's fragrance, rather than Fauré's perfume, a distinction musicologists cherish and policemen rarely notice, though I have never been entirely obedient to my profession's limitations. Then came the cadence, the gratitude of an ending, the communal breath of accomplishment. And after it, the insolence. One voice, not loud, not showy, simply enduring. A held pitch, neither triumph nor complaint, as if the note had forgotten how to die. It wavered fractionally in a way no organ pipe would admit. The human larynx confesses its mortality in those tiny betrayals. Someone had lingered deliberately, ensuring we heard their persistence. I stopped the tape, rewound a careful measure, listened again. The sustained sound returned like a nerve, insisting on recognition. An ison, perhaps the old Byzantine drone that undergirds chant, though that would be pedantry unless it carried meaning. My crossword, abandoned on the chair's arm, offered coincidence I distrusted even as I welcomed it, one who never stops talking. 5 letters. The pencil lay where I had left it. I wrote drone and disliked the neatness of the solution. The telephone's ring entered as if it had been waiting in the hall with damp coat and urgent news. Strange, who never learned graceful beginnings, asked if I was available. I told him I usually am. He reported that Dr. Helena Ashworth, director of music at Street Simeon's College, had been discovered dead in the chapel organ loft some hours earlier. Likely natural causes, he added, but unsettling nonetheless. Halloween night, he mentioned, knowing my susceptibility to irony. I asked who found her. The porter, at first light, though he might have looked sooner if he had trusted rumors. Could I attend? I said I was already listening to the choir. After the call, the room aged by several degrees. Rain tightened its grip on the windows, and the street below dissolved into smeared palettes of headlights and reflection. I replayed the final moments, that persistent note extending beyond patience, before ending as if withdrawn rather than spent. No scrape of chair, no cough, no footstep. Whoever sang had mastered the art of leaving no trace except intention. Drone, I thought. while rain began its quiet erasure of the evening outside my window. Lewis navigated Oxford's arteries with the patience of a man who understands that medieval streets accommodate modern urgency reluctantly. The morning had settled into that particular grey which makes stone seem older and secrets more plausible. Street. Simeon's College revealed itself through wrought iron gates, cloisters embracing a quadrangle so precisely maintained it resembled scholarship made visible in turf and limestone. Rain had left everything gleaming with the kind of cleanliness that suggests recent washing of sins. The chapel stood at the quad's heart, Gothic arches reaching toward conclusions that remained perpetually deferred. Inside, beeswax and centuries mingled in the air, that particular fragrance of devotion preserved in oak and prayer books. The organ loft commanded the nave from its gallery, accessible by a spiral stair worn smooth by generations of choristers, and now, unfortunately, by constables. Dr. Helena Ashworth had been discovered there at dawn by the porter, a man whose unfortunate gift for finding what others preferred hidden had served the college faithfully for 30 years. The body had been removed, leaving only the impression of absence and a music stand bearing yesterday's anthem. Heart attack, the preliminary examination suggested. Though I have learned to distrust preliminary examinations as thoroughly as I distrust preliminary motives. Helena Ashworth, 53, respected musicologist, keeper of musical secrets that apparently proved more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Reverend Dr. Marcus Finch arrived wearing grief-like academic robes, appropriate and slightly rehearsed. His condolences possessed the measured cadence of someone accustomed to making sorrow sound reasonable, though he claimed Helena as both colleague and cherished friend. We stood in the Lady Chapel while he explained their collaboration on various musical projects, his voice carrying decades of consoling strangers through tragedies both large and small. When I mentioned the Halloween performance, he quoted what he believed to be Eliot with the confidence of ownership. The music heard so deeply it is not heard at all, which is the prayer and the rest. My mind protested gently. 4 quartets takes paraphrase badly, and the actual line speaks of music heard so deeply that it is not heard at all. But you are the music while the music lasts. Small errors often betray large anxieties. Professor James Wickham possessed the restless energy of a conductor even in conversation, his hands shaping invisible melodies while he spoke of Helena's brilliance. They had worked together for 15 years, he explained, developing the college's reputation for sacred music performance. The Halloween concert represented months of preparation, featuring what he called Fauré's most challenging requiem, though the program I examined clearly listed Duruflé throughout. When I mentioned this discrepancy, his hands stopped moving entirely. A conductor's nightmare made manifest. Dr. Sarah Pemberton arrived with academic ambition, worn like expensive perfume. Her grief complicated by what appeared to be professional frustration. She had been Helena's student, then colleague, then rival in the complex choreography of university politics. Her research focused on the same medieval manuscripts that had consumed Helena's final months, creating what she termed healthy competition, though her tone suggested otherwise. She spoke of Helena's recent obsession with historical accuracy, her determination to correct misconceptions about the college's musical heritage. Margaret Thornfield emerged from the archives like someone who preferred documents to people, her knowledge of institutional history encyclopedic, yet somehow incomplete. She had provided Helena access to manuscripts few scholars requested, documents relating to the college's founding and original musical traditions. When discussing the chapel's layout, she referred to the choir stalls as pews, a mistake no archivist familiar with ecclesiastical architecture should make. Her correction came too quickly, rehearsed. Each offered alibis wrapped in appropriate sorrow, their grief measured and scholarly, and somehow insufficient. Lewis collected their statements while I examined the visitor's book, where someone had signed in at 22:10 using a fountain pen rather than the provided ballpoint. My crossword, folded in my jacket, offered its own commentary. 12 down, seats for singers, 6 letters. The penciled answer had been corrected from PWS to stalls, as if someone had rehearsed precision rather than trusted instinct. The chapel's silence absorbed our questions and returned nothing, keeping counsel about what happened when Halloween's performance ended and someone chose to sing alone in the darkness above. Helena Ashworth's study occupied a Victorian terrace near Port Meadow, where autumn light filtered through diamond panes onto shelves, chronicling 5 centuries of musical devotion. Books leaned against manuscripts with the casual intimacy of old friends, while recordings nested among correspondence like secrets waiting to be discovered. The desk suggested a scholar who worked with methodical passion, racing against time she hadn't known was borrowed. Voices from Oxford's past represented ambition disguised as service. A series of narrated audiobooks designed to resurrect forgotten musical manuscripts alongside their historical contexts. Helena had recorded in chapels across the university, capturing not merely performances but the acoustic memories of stones that had absorbed centuries of prayer and politics. Each episode married scholarship with atmosphere, transforming dusty archives into living testimony where the past might speak through carefully arranged harmonies. Nora Ellington arrived carrying equipment cases and the slightly harried expression of someone whose technical precision serves artistic temperaments. She had produced Helena's recordings for 3 years, her studio near Jericho, a sanctuary where music submitted to digital discipline. Helena's project, she explained, had grown increasingly ambitious, her determination to present historical truth rather than comfortable fiction, creating tensions that extended beyond academic circles. The Halloween recording at St. Simeon's was intended as the centerpiece of an episode exploring medieval choir traditions and their connection to All Souls' Day, when boundaries between past and present become negotiable. Helena had planned to weave the performance with commentary on how traditions often begin as accidents of guilt, a narrative that apparently disturbed someone enough to take action. The sustained note, Nora confirmed, was neither accident nor technical malfunction. Someone had deliberately held that pitch after the official performance concluded, creating what she termed an unauthorized coda. Helena had noticed it immediately during playback, rewinding the passage repeatedly while her expression shifted from puzzlement to recognition to something approaching comprehension. The voice belonged to someone in the choir, though identifying the specific singer from a sustained note proved impossible, even with sophisticated analysis. More troubling were the anonymous letters Helena had received, correspondence that arrived with increasing frequency as her research deepened. The earliest came 6 weeks before her death, typewritten on cream paper, warning Helena to abandon certain aspects of her investigation. The language possessed an educated formality that suggested academic familiarity with intimidation. Your investigation into historical matters, better left undisturbed, serves no constructive purpose, and may cause unnecessary distress to families whose ancestors deserve respectful silence. Subsequent letters grew more specific, mentioning Helena's research into a 15th century scandal involving St. Simeon's founding benefactors. The final letter, dated 3 days before Halloween, abandoned pretense entirely. Some voices from the past should remain silent, and those who insist on speaking for them may find their own voices permanently stilled. The typeface suggested an old machine, possibly maintained by someone who valued tradition over convenience. Helena's research had uncovered something more significant than academic scandal, something connecting medieval corruption to modern consequences. Her files contained correspondence with genealogical societies, photocopied parish records, and a partially decoded Latin text hidden within musical notation. She had discovered how medieval musicians concealed testimony within their compositions, creating a musical cryptography that survived centuries of deliberate forgetting. The project files revealed Helena's growing conviction about bloodline responsibility and inherited guilt. Her belief that historical crimes echo through generations like sustained notes that never properly resolve. She had planned to reveal everything during the Halloween performance, using the audiobook format to present evidence that would survive her should anything happen. My crossword, abandoned in the car, offered its own commentary, 7 across, voices from beyond, 6 letters. The answer seemed insufficient for what Helena had uncovered, though perhaps accurate for what someone had tried to silence through methods more permanent than anonymous correspondence. Helena Ashworth's study possessed the particular melancholy of scholarship pursued beyond wisdom's counsel, where coffee rings on vellum, suggested devotion bordering on dangerous obsession. October light filtered through diamond panes onto shelves that chronicled 5 centuries of musical devotion, while her desk bore evidence of recent intensity, magnifying glasses abandoned mid-examination, photocopies arranged like accusations awaiting judgment, fountain pens dried to uselessness beside notebooks filled with increasingly urgent marginalia. The medieval manuscripts had consumed her final weeks, their pages photographed, transcribed, and analyzed with the methodical passion of someone racing against an unspecified deadline. Among her papers, I discovered correspondence with genealogical societies, letters requesting family histories that stretched back to the 15th century, responses that arrived with increasing reluctance as her questions grew more pointed. She had been mapping bloodlines with the precision of someone plotting a crime scene, connecting medieval names to modern families with threads that suggested conspiracy rather than coincidence. The Latin text emerged from musical notation like testimony hidden in plain sight, its words woven between staves with the cunning of someone who understood that scholars read music differently than they read prose. Helena's translation, penciled in margins with corrections and reconsiderations, revealed what appeared to be a confession about the theft of church treasures, systematic looting disguised as religious devotion. The original Street Simeon's choir, according to this musical cryptography, had served as unwitting accomplices, their voices providing sacred cover for crimes committed in the name of founding a college. Her computer's search history read like a graduate seminar in moral archaeology: inherited guilt, bloodline responsibility, musical cryptography, medieval confession, institutional complicity. The browser tabs remained open, frozen testimony to her final research session. She had been investigating how historical crimes echo through generations, whether descendants bear responsibility for ancestral sins, how institutions built on corruption might be held accountable centuries later. The genealogical research proved most disturbing, connecting several current college members to families involved in the medieval scandal. Her charts resembled family trees grown malignant, branches extending from 15th century perpetrators to 20th century beneficiaries. Reverend Dr. Finch's lineage traced directly to the original dean who orchestrated the theft, while Professor Wickham descended from merchants who profited from selling stolen ecclesiastical treasures. Even Margaret Thornfield's ancestors appeared, minor players, in a conspiracy that apparently required archival complicity. Lewis discovered the digitalis medication in her kitchen, occupying the counter with pharmaceutical innocence beside herbal teas and forgotten spices. The prescription bore her doctor's signature and recent dates, suggesting legitimate medical need rather than sinister acquisition. Yet the timing troubled me, the convenience of a heart attack occurring precisely when Helena planned to expose centuries-old crimes seemed choreographed rather than coincidental. Her notebook's final entries revealed plans for what she termed a grand revelation during the Halloween performance. Her intention to set the record straight after 5 centuries of institutional silence. She had discovered that the college's founding endowments derived from stolen church treasures, that several prominent Oxford families built their fortunes on medieval theft, that the choir tradition itself began as cover for systematic looting. My crossword, retrieved from the car where I had abandoned it that morning, offered its own medieval commentary. 12 across. Ancient burden passed down. 6 letters. I penciled legacy and disliked the words neutral innocence when applied to crimes that had echoed through centuries. Helena's research suggested that some secrets grow more dangerous with age, that time transforms theft into tradition and makes exposure increasingly costly for those whose reputations depend on historical amnesia. The manuscripts lay open to pages bearing musical notation that concealed accusations, their beauty masking testimony that someone had found worth killing to suppress. In the fading light, the Latin phrases seemed to shimmer between the staves like ghosts demanding recognition. While outside the window, Oxford continued its ancient conversation between past and present, unaware that one voice had been permanently silenced. Oxford keeps its better wines underground, and its better secrets as well. Professor James Wickham's warehouse hid behind Hythe Bridge Street, where autumn light filtered through grimy windows onto racks that rose like modest confessionals. He moved among them with a conductor's precision, though his hands had abandoned their usual choreography of invisible melodies. The air carried cork and sulphur, the honest sense of commerce that seemed to embarrass him in the presence of tragedy. When pressed about his movements on Halloween night, Wickham's composure finally fractured. He spoke the truth with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed confession without anticipating an audience. He had loved Helena Ashworth for 15 years. The admission arrived, wrapped in accumulated longing. His affection, having aged like wine in cellars where light never intrudes. Rehearsals where her corrections felt like blessings, dinners postponed indefinitely. A life arranged around the hope that courage might eventually overcome propriety. He had returned to the chapel after the performance concluded, waiting until the choir dispersed and the college settled into nocturnal quiet. His intention was declaration rather than investigation, a middle-aged academic's belated attempt to speak words that work had always interrupted. He climbed the spiral stairs carrying 15 years of unspoken devotion, only to discover Helena slumped over the keyboard where her final chord had been silence. Panic, he admitted, proved stronger than duty. The discovery of her death, combined with his unauthorized presence and years of secret affection, created a narrative he feared no magistrate would believe. He had fled without alerting authorities, leaving Helena alone with whatever tragedy had claimed her. The timeline discrepancies that had troubled Lewis suddenly resolved themselves, though new questions emerged like wine stains that spread despite attempts at concealment. His sleeve brushed the counter and left a faint shine. Beeswax announced itself beneath the cellar scents. I filed it beside other small truths that prefer corners. In his pocket, a fountain pen, burgundy, protruded like a misplaced flower. I remembered the chapel visitor's book, where elegant handwriting had signed at 2210 instead of using the provided ballpoint. Coincidence remains a tiresome relative. One keeps an eye on the silver. Helena had spoken recently of planning to expose what she termed the truth about our founding sins during the Halloween performance. Her research having uncovered connections between medieval theft and modern prosperity. Someone had been meeting with her secretly, attempting to dissuade her from pursuing revelations that would, in their words, serve no useful purpose and cause unnecessary distress to families whose only crime was inheriting ancestral consequences. These meetings had been arranged through intermediaries and conducted with diplomatic discretion, suggesting Helena's research threatened interests powerful enough to require careful handling. She had grown increasingly determined as pressure intensified, her academic integrity proving stronger than whatever inducements or threats her mysterious correspondent offered. More troubling, Helena had recently discovered anomalies in the college's wine cellar records, ledgers dating to the 15th century that documented payments to original choir members. The amount seemed unusually generous for the period, far exceeding what simple musical services would warrant. Wickham's expertise revealed that the choir members had received compensation equivalent to substantial modern salaries, disguised as donations for instruments and robes, but suggesting something more valuable than liturgical accessories was being purchased. My crossword, patient in my jacket pocket, offered commentary on deception. 8 down, payment for silence, 5 letters. I penciled bribe and wondered whether medieval corruption differed significantly from its modern descendants, or whether only the currency had changed while the essential transaction remained constant. Outside, the canal kept its counsel, while Oxford sifted light into plausible versions of itself. Love, I have observed, sharpens the eye for detail while blunting appetite for consequences. Somewhere, a small note began to hold, the kind that pretends to be background music while concealing its own accusations. The college archives occupied a Victorian basement where centuries had exhaled their secrets into air that never quite refreshed itself. Margaret Thornfield moved among the shelves with the measured precision of someone who understood that knowledge, like wine, required careful handling. The smell of vellum and preservation chemicals created an atmosphere where time behaved differently, where medieval manuscripts rested beside modern catalogues like old friends sharing comfortable silences. Under questioning, Margaret's carefully maintained composure began to fracture along lines that suggested long practice at concealment. She admitted to selectively providing Helena access to historical documents, her professional discretion extending beyond mere archival policy. Certain manuscripts, she explained with the delicate phrasing of someone accustomed to euphemism, required special consideration due to their sensitive contents rather than their physical fragility. Her confession arrived wrapped in genealogical inevitability. Her own family tree traced directly back to Thomas de Thornfield, one of the medieval benefactors implicated in Helena's research. The admission carried the weight of inherited burden, ancestral guilt passed down through generations like uncomfortable heirloom silver that required periodic polishing. Her ancestor had served as the college's first treasurer, a position that apparently involved more creative accounting than subsequent centuries had acknowledged. Several prominent Oxford families, Margaret revealed, had maintained an unspoken conspiracy of silence about their shared ancestral embarrassment. The Finches, the Wickhams, the Thornfields, and others descended from those involved in what she termed the founding irregularities had long known about the church treasure scandal. Knowledge had been transmitted through hushed conversations and careful omissions, all designed to protect reputations and positions that depended on historical amnesia. Helena's research threatened to transform private shame into public scandal, her determination to publish findings that would destroy not merely family names, but call into question the legitimacy of the college's founding endowments. Modern prosperity built on medieval theft creates legal complications, extending beyond historical embarrassment, potentially affecting trusts, scholarships, and institutional standing that had survived 5 centuries of careful silence. Margaret's alibi appeared unassailable. She had been cataloguing manuscripts in the Bodleian until late evening, then continued working in the restricted collection. Yet something in her phrasing troubled me. The Bodleian's definition of late seldom survives the porter's patience, and her reader's card showed an exit time that contradicted her claimed dedication to nocturnal scholarship. When discussing a 15th-century herbal manuscript she had been studying, Margaret mentioned digitalis with casual familiarity that resonated like a wrong note in familiar music. The plant's properties, she explained, were well documented in medieval sources, its dual nature as medicine and poison, making it particularly valuable to those who understood dosage. Foxglove, she added almost as afterthought, grows wild throughout Oxfordshire and has been used for heart conditions since the Renaissance, though the margin between therapeutic and toxic remains dangerously narrow. Her knowledge seemed excessive for someone whose expertise lay in documentary preservation rather than pharmacology. She spoke of digitalis concentration, seasonal variations in potency, and cumulative effects of regular small doses with authority that suggested research extending beyond academic curiosity. The digitalis found in Helena's kitchen suddenly acquired new significance. My crossword, patient in my jacket pocket, offered its own commentary. 9 across, keeper of dangerous knowledge. 9 letters. I penciled archivist and wondered whether the definition encompassed more than professional duty. Margaret's fingers, I noticed, bore faint stains of green ink, the same distinctive shade I had observed in the chapel visitor's book beside an entry timed at 22:10. She corrected herself again when I mentioned the choir pews, too quickly to suggest natural instinct. Stalls, she said, then smiled with precision that cancelled warmth. It was the second rehearsed correction from someone whose expertise should have made such errors impossible. Outside, Oxford's bells marked hours that had accumulated into centuries while underground. Among documents that remembered when silence was purchased rather than inherited, Margaret Thornfield continued arranging the past into acceptable narratives, her ink-stained fingers suggesting she understood that some archives require more active curation than others. Helena Ashworth's personal effects had been catalogued with the efficient melancholy that accompanies official intrusion into private lives. I returned to her study because the dead often leave their most honest testimony where the living have learned to overlook it. Among the evidence bags, her crossword puzzle lay half-finished, the grid bearing witness to a mind that sought patterns even in leisure. The clues possessed an uncomfortable relevance that made coincidence seem insufficient. 7 across asked for echo of a lost voice, and Helena had penciled phantom with the confidence of recognition. 12 down requested medieval singer's confession in 8 letters, answered with penitent in her precise hand. Other completed answers scattered across the puzzle like breadcrumbs leading toward revelation. When I traced the completed answers in numerical sequence, they spelled out an accusation that transformed wordplay into testimony. Margaret knows about the confession. Helena had discovered something requiring encryption, her academic mind seeking refuge in puzzles when direct confrontation proved impossible. The crossword had become insurance, coded testimony designed to survive her should circumstances demand posthumous revelation. This discovery prompted intensive re-examination of the medieval manuscripts. The 15th century hymnal containing Helena's musical cryptography lay open in the college archives, where Margaret Thornfield moved among the shelves with practiced discretion. The manuscript appeared intact until closer inspection revealed surgical precision. One crucial folio had been removed so carefully that casual examination might miss the absence. The binding showed no violence, the remaining pages undisturbed, suggesting expertise and unlimited access. Helena's research notes revealed what the missing page had contained: specific names connecting medieval choir members to systematic theft of church artifacts, detailed descriptions of how sacred music provided cover for smuggling operations, testimony about college officials transforming stolen treasures into founding endowments. When confronted with the crossword's accusation and the manuscript's mutilation, Margaret's carefully maintained composure finally fractured. She admitted removing the page years earlier, during her initial examination of the collection. Her family's genealogical research had revealed their ancestors' central role in the medieval scandal, prompting preemptive action to protect reputations that had survived 5 centuries of deliberate silence. Her justification carried the measured tone of rehearsed rationalization. She claimed to have acted only to prevent Helena from discovering evidence that would destroy innocent families whose sole crime was inheriting ancestral guilt. The page's removal represented preservation rather than destruction, archival mercy designed to protect the living from uncomfortable testimony of the dead. Yet Margaret's knowledge of medieval pharmacology cast her protestations in suspicious light. When discussing the manuscript's herbal references, she mentioned digitalis derivatives with authority extending beyond casual scholarship. She spoke of foxglove's seasonal potency, optimal harvesting methods, and cumulative effects of regular small doses with precision suggesting practical rather than theoretical understanding. Her fingers bore familiar green ink stains, the same distinctive shade I had observed in the chapel visitor's book beside an entry timed at 22:10. When I mentioned her claimed presence at the Bodleian that evening, she corrected herself too quickly about closing times, her expertise faltering under pressure. She insisted she had only wanted to prevent discovery, not cause harm, but her casual discourse on digitalis and its therapeutic window revealed knowledge that transformed archival duty into something more sinister. The missing page had contained not merely historical embarrassment, but evidence of crimes whose modern beneficiaries remained vulnerable to exposure. My own crossword, patient in my jacket pocket, offered commentary on concealment. 9 down, deliberately hidden evidence, 4 letters. I penciled lift and recognized the inadequacy of the solution. Some removals require more permanent methods than archival surgery. Outside, November light filtered through diamond panes onto Oxford's ancient stones, where centuries of careful silence had protected reputations built on forgotten crimes. Inside the archives, among manuscripts that remembered when truth was more dangerous than ignorance, Margaret Thornfield continued her custodial duties, her ink-stained fingers suggesting she understood that some preservation requires more active intervention than others. The crossword's answer had been correct. Margaret did know about the confession. The question remaining was how far her knowledge had extended into action. Nora Ellington's studio occupied a converted Victorian stable near Jericho, where the ancient whisper of horses had been replaced by the precise hum of modern electronics. Cables coiled across the floor like patient snakes, connecting sophisticated equipment that gleamed under focused lights. The air carried ozone and coffee, sharp contrasts to the beeswax and centuries I had grown accustomed to at Street Simeon's. She moved among the mixing boards with fluid confidence, someone who understood that technology serves art only when properly disciplined. The equipment revealed capabilities extending far beyond simple recording, digital displays flickering like electronic candles in the perpetual twilight of windowless rooms. Nora demonstrated with chilling impartiality how easily the sustained note could have been engineered. A simple digital extension could stretch a single vocal pitch indefinitely, creating artificial echoes that suggested presence where there was none. She highlighted the waveform on her monitors, jagged hills translating devotion into geometry, then time-stretched it with a slider that moved like a thermometer measuring deception. "We can make voices stay longer than lungs permit," she explained, "but breath leaves fingerprints." On the manipulated version, the room's natural rustle dissolved into perfect obedience. On the original, tiny betrayals remained a throat-clearing, a soft creak from the stalls, the rustle of a turned page. When we magnified the final seconds, identical acoustic signatures repeated with surgical precision, copy rather than providence. Such manipulation could serve multiple purposes: establishing false timelines, protecting alibis, or suggesting Helena remained alive when she had already been silenced. The technical sophistication required expertise that few possessed, but which Nora commanded with effortless authority. Helena had approached her months earlier with an unusual request: help expose the truth about the medieval scandal through the audiobook format. Their collaboration had evolved beyond recording into investigative journalism, using atmospheric presentations to make historical evidence compelling rather than merely academic. Helena believed narrative power might succeed where scholarly publication had failed. The project had grown increasingly ambitious as Helena's research deepened, their planned revelation designed to present evidence in a format that would survive suppression attempts. They had recorded preliminary episodes at various college chapels, creating a musical map of Oxford's hidden history, though the Halloween performance was intended as the centerpiece that would finally break 5 centuries of institutional silence. Helena had been receiving increasingly threatening messages throughout October, correspondence escalating from polite discouragement to explicit intimidation. The final communication abandoned subtlety entirely, accompanied by a single foxglove stem left on the mixing desk, a botanical signature from someone intimately familiar with digitalis properties. The studio break-in occurred the week before Helena's death. Nothing appeared stolen, equipment undisturbed, yet violation lingered in ways transcending property damage. Files had been examined with professional discretion, backup drives accessed by someone who understood digital storage systems. On the desk, a studio diary showed a page torn cleanly from the spiral. The next page redrawn from memory with angles too neat. Investigation of the audio equipment confirmed unauthorized access. The Halloween recording showed a last save at 23:41 by an account called Guest, though the computer's clock argued with the wall clock by 3 minutes. I have learned to trust quarrels between machines. They quarrel only when someone has intervened. The sustained note, while originating from a human voice, had been digitally lengthened and layered to create its haunting persistence. Whether this manipulation concealed a crime or represented part of Helena's planned revelation remained unclear, a final message encoded in musical testimony designed to survive her death. My crossword offered commentary on deception. 11 across. False evidence created electronically. 8 letters. I penciled artifact and wondered whether the sustained note represented truth or fabrication. The studio's isolation created an atmosphere where whispers could be amplified into accusations and accusations reduced to silence. Among equipment capable of transforming reality into whatever narrative served necessity, truth waited to be distinguished from manipulation. While outside, Oxford continued its ancient conversation between past and present. The organ loft possessed the particular silence of places where music has died, its wooden console suspended above the nave like unfinished business awaiting resolution. I returned there because the dead often leave their most honest testimony where the living have learned to overlook it. And Helena Ashworth had been methodical in ways that extended beyond academic habit. Something about the stonework troubled me, medieval precision interrupted by modern necessity. One block near the organ bench sat slightly proud of its neighbors, mortar lines suggesting recent disturbance. The dust had failed to accumulate there with democracy's patience, and when I pressed, the stone shifted with the reluctant compliance of secrets long concealed. Behind it lay Helena's insurance, a small digital recorder, black plastic incongruous among stones that had learned to age gracefully. She had hidden it with the methodical care of someone who understood that evidence must survive the witness. The device bore her fingerprints and October's dust, testament to desperate foresight. The recording began with Halloween's aftermath, footsteps ascending the spiral stairs with measured deliberation. Someone familiar with the route needed no guidance through ancient darkness. The conversation that followed possessed the terrible intimacy of old friends discussing murder. Reverend Dr. Marcus Finch's voice carried institutional authority unchanged by proximity to violence. He spoke with weary patience, explaining necessity to the naive. Helena's research threatened not merely historical reputations but current financial architecture, college endowments, family trusts, charitable foundations, all built on wealth derived from systematically stolen church treasures. The original conspiracy had required generations of careful silence. His ancestor had orchestrated theft with ecclesiastical authority, transforming sacred relics into secular prosperity through networks extending across medieval England. The choir served as unwitting accomplices, their voices providing sacred cover while treasure disappeared into private collections. Modern descendants had inherited more than guilt, they had inherited institutions whose legitimacy depended on historical amnesia. The Finch family trust funded his position and lifestyle, while several prominent Oxford families confronted the criminal origins of their social standing. Helena's audiobook project would transform private shame into public scandal, with legal ramifications extending centuries into the future. Finch admitted to systematic poisoning with clinical detachment. His weekly meetings with Helena provided opportunity to adjust her digitalis dosage gradually, exploiting pastoral concern to administer death in measured increments. The medication's legitimate prescription provided perfect cover. Heart failure would surprise no one familiar with her condition. He had hoped Helena would abandon her research when faced with increasing symptoms, declining health, serving as natural discouragement. When she persisted and planned public revelation during the Halloween performance, murder became his desperate solution. The final dose, administered during their last pastoral meeting, was calculated to ensure she would not survive to speak her accusations. Helena's responses revealed complete understanding of both historical crime and modern consequence. She spoke with the clarity of someone who had solved the puzzle entirely. Academic triumph shadowed by recognition that knowledge had become her death sentence. Her voice grew weaker as digitalis claimed her heart, yet she managed final words directed toward the hidden recorder. The evidence survives, and voices from the past will finally be heard. The recording ended with Finch's departure and Helena's labored breathing, Oxford's bells marking time that had run out for truth. In the silence that followed, the loft resumed its measured breathing, while I contemplated the weight of inherited sin. My crossword, patient in my jacket pocket, offered commentary on persistence. 11 across, one who continues beyond natural limits. 7 letters. I penciled phantom and recognized the accuracy. Helena's voice would indeed continue speaking long after her death. Outside, November rain began its gentle erasure of the morning, while inside the loft, Helena's hidden recorder waited to transform whispered murder into shouted justice. The sustained note had found its meaning at last. Oxford wore November like borrowed vestments that afternoon, the light thin as communion wine and twice as bitter. I walked to the deanery through cloisters, where rain had left its confession on ancient stones, carrying Helena's hidden recorder like evidence of original sin. The building received me with institutional courtesy, all oak paneling and inherited authority, though the air carried something sharper than beeswax, the metallic taste of approaching revelation. Marcus Finch awaited me in his study, surrounded by books that had failed to teach him wisdom and portraits that offered no absolution. His grandfather's painted eyes regarded us with proprietary melancholy above the mantel, while a vase of spent foxgloves drooped with last week's devotion. When I placed the digital recorder on his desk, the room's acoustics seemed to shift, as if the walls themselves were preparing to bear witness. The recording spoke with Helena's voice, growing weaker as Digitalis claimed her heart, while Finch's responses revealed the full scope of his desperate conspiracy. His ancestor had not merely participated in the medieval theft, but orchestrated it, using ecclesiastical authority to transform systematic looting into college endowments. The Finch Family Trust, which funded his comfortable position and academic pursuits, drew its prosperity from those same stolen church treasures, money that had flowed through generations like inherited guilt. Financial records traced the connections with bureaucratic precision. Modern accounting left clearer footprints than medieval crime, revealing how charitable foundations and family settlements had been replenished whenever antique ecclesiastical items found their way to market. The college's endowments glowed with radiance that had once belonged to altars in distant parishes, theft sanctified by time and careful documentation. His systematic poisoning of Helena emerged with clinical clarity. Weekly pastoral meetings had provided perfect opportunity to adjust her Digitalis dosage, exploiting her trust in him as both colleague and spiritual advisor. He had hoped declining health would discourage her research, that physical weakness might succeed where persuasion had failed. When she persisted and planned to expose everything during the Halloween performance, he made the final, fatal adjustment with calculated precision. The literary errors that had troubled me throughout the investigation now revealed their significance. His misquoting of Eliot, the confusion between composers, the small inaccuracies inconsistent with scholarly reputation. Stress takes many disguises, but pedantry rarely forgives. A mind preoccupied with murder finds little attention for precision in secondary matters. Confronted with irrefutable evidence, Finch confessed with weary resignation. His carefully constructed life had collapsed under ancestral sins that 5 centuries of silence had failed to absolve. He spoke of impossible choices between preserving institutions and revealing corrupt foundations, of fearing the loss of everything that defined him. The words came as explanation rather than plea, delivered with the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed this moment during sleepless nights. He admitted everything: the gradual poisoning, the anonymous letters, the desperate hope that Helena would abandon her investigation when faced with increasing symptoms. His confession possessed academic thoroughness, though the history in question was his own descent into murder. My crossword, patient in my jacket pocket, offered final commentary. 11 across. Burden passed through bloodlines. 10 letters. I penciled inheritance and recognized the theological precision of the solution. Some debts, it seemed, required generational payment. Outside, Oxford's bells marked time with ancient patience, while inside, Marcus Finch signed his statement with the same fountain pen that had marked the chapel visitor's book on Halloween night. The sustained note had finally found its resolution in justice delayed but not denied, though I wondered whether any chord, however perfect, could absolve what centuries of careful silence had failed to cleanse. Oxford absorbed the arrest with institutional discretion, preferring its scandals wrapped in academic courtesy rather than displayed with tabloid enthusiasm. Marcus Finch submitted to handcuffs with weary dignity, his carefully constructed world finally acknowledging its foundation of sand. Lewis handled the procedural necessities, while I contemplated how 5 centuries of silence had collapsed into a single November afternoon, rain streaking the lodge windows like delayed tears. The medieval scandal revealed itself with archaeological precision, each layer exposing deeper corruption. The original theft had involved not merely treasure, but sacred relics, fragments of saints' bones, illuminated manuscripts, ecclesiastical silver that had adorned altars across medieval England. Multiple families had shared the profits, their complicity ensuring mutual silence through generations of inherited guilt. The Finches orchestrated, the Wickhams transported, the Thornfields documented, while others provided markets where sacred objects became secular commodities. Helena's audiobook project would have transformed whispered knowledge into public accusation, her narrative power capable of making medieval crime feel contemporary. The financial implications extended beyond embarrassment into legal territory where foundations themselves were questioned. Endowments worth millions, charitable trusts, family settlements, all potentially invalidated by revelation that their prosperity derived from systematic theft. The college faced a crisis transcending reputation, its legitimacy called into question by evidence that founding benefactors were accomplished criminals rather than pious donors. Several prominent Oxford families confronted uncomfortable recalibration of their histories, social standing accumulated over centuries, suddenly requiring explanation rather than acceptance. Helena's determination had proven stronger than murder, her voice continuing beyond death through carefully planted evidence. The sustained note that began our investigation found its meaning in persistence that transcended physical limitations. The one voice that never stopped was Helena's refusal to let truth die with her, a final act of scholarly defiance that would echo through whatever remained of Oxford's institutional memory. Lewis completed his reports with methodical efficiency, reducing complex moral archaeology to procedural requirements. The Crown Prosecution Service would handle legal complexities, while Oxford adjusted as Oxford does, through careful adaptation and selective amnesia. Students hurried past with umbrellas, untroubled by revelations that their tutorials rested upon older, noisier conversations. I walked through the city that evening, past stones that had absorbed centuries of secrets. The chapel stood shuttered, its loft roped off, the stalls wearing their dust honestly. A cleaner's cart had left faint wax trails near the north aisle, and I remembered the sheen on Wickham's sleeve when courage had failed him on the spiral stairs. Small truths do not retire when large ones take the stage. They simply continue being true. My crossword, finally completed during the long afternoon of statements and charges, offered its own commentary on persistence. 11 across. Burden passed through bloodlines. 10 letters. I penciled inheritance and recognized the theological precision of the solution. Some debts, it seemed, required generational payment, though whether the present could truly atone for the sins of the distant past remained an open question. The past never ends. It modulates. We had arrested the newest custodian of an old design, but the pattern remained, woven through benefactions and hymnals, and the way rain finds the same course down stained glass, despite centuries of polishing. The moral complexities of inherited guilt settled around me like autumn fog, thick and pervasive. Lewis met me in the quad and asked, because he is kind, whether I would eat. Another time, I said, and he pretended to believe me. We watched lamps come on along the cloister, each accepting its square of darkness, while somewhere a bell struck 7 one note, then another. Then a pause long enough to hear what followed, which was silence doing its complicated work for those who listened carefully to what history refuses to forget. November arrived without ceremony, settling over Oxford like a librarian's careful silence. The investigation had ended, but its echoes persisted like that sustained note which began our acquaintance with Helena Ashworth's posthumous testimony. I walked through streets where autumn light filtered through air that carried winter's preliminary negotiations. Past Street, Simeon's College, where the chapel bells tolled with measured solemnity, marking time for those who still believed in its redemptive possibilities. The college would survive, as institutions always do, shedding scandal like seasonal clothing while preserving essential character. The porter nodded with careful neutrality as I passed, his face revealing nothing of the upheaval that had transformed his quiet domain into something requiring police attention. But the air had changed. Even stone containing memory when taught how to listen properly. Helena's audiobook project would be completed posthumously, Nora Ellington having volunteered to honor their collaboration despite its dangerous conclusions. Voices from Oxford's past would speak after all. Medieval testimony emerging from musical cryptography to challenge centuries of comfortable silence. The past never ends, I reflected. It merely modulates, finding new instruments to carry its persistent themes. I found myself drawn to the record shop on Walton Street, where vinyl recordings leaned against each other with familiar immodesty. The clerk asked if I wanted Fauré, the usual confusion. I requested Duruflé instead, correcting the error that had troubled Professor Wickham during his nervous alibis. Small mistakes often reveal large anxieties, though in this case stress rather than guilt had caused the musical confusion. The young clerk smiled with the grace of someone who understood that correcting customers required delicate timing. He fetched a pressing whose sleeve bore the honest scent of someone else's careful room, slipping the receipt across the counter with a pen that paused fractionally over the title. The hesitation reminded me of the cassette label's librarian hand, suggesting the unfranked package had been delivered by someone who knew where I lived without requiring directories. Returning to my Jericho flat, I poured wine that had waited without complaint and set the needle carefully. Duruflé's Requiem opened like a door one assumes locked until it yields, strings and organ weaving sacred conversation between sorrow and solace. The choir understood consolation better than praise, their Latin carrying grief with adult restraint rather than theatrical excess. The final movement arrived without ceremony, a blessing phrased as geography rather than theology. In Paradisum Deducante Angeli, the voices sang, and I found myself listening not merely to music, but to the spaces between notes where meaning often hides. The record completed its gradual bow, leaving companionable silence that follows honest work. Yet beyond that silence, I imagined hearing something not the obstinate note of our beginning, but a different persistence. The quiet satisfaction of truth finally spoken, of medieval crimes acknowledged after centuries of institutional amnesia. Justice, I have learned, rarely announces itself with fanfare. It arrives in whispers, small, insistent pressures that eventually reshape the landscape of acceptable truth. My crossword waited on the chair's arm, one blank remaining unaccountably patient. 15 across. Final word in sacred music. 4 letters. I penciled AMN and regretted its neatness, even as I accepted the solution's theological precision. Some conclusions resist elegant summarization, though crosswords demand tidier endings than life typically provides. Outside, Oxford continued its ancient conversation between past and present, stones absorbing another layer of history, while students hurried toward futures that would inherit whatever we had managed to preserve or destroy. Somewhere beyond the window, a church bell released itself from evening's economy, sounding once, as if to verify its existence before choosing stillness. The wine finished itself while echoes faded into memory, leaving me with satisfaction that accompanies cases where patience proves stronger than pursuit. I turned the record, though nothing remained to play, letting the stylus travel empty grooves until even that small argument with silence agreed to end.